What's going on, everybody? Kalipus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, I'm going to be giving you some reasons why you might not want the OnePlus Nord N300 5G. Now, for the most part, I actually do think this is a pretty good phone, and for what it is, I do think it provides a lot of value. But like any device, it does have some drawbacks, so we're going to be going over some of those to give you a better idea of what you can expect if you get it. Now, as always, if you want to learn more about this phone, definitely check out the description, where we'll be linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. So my first reason why you might not want the OnePlus Nord N300 5G is because we're only getting a 720p resolution. Now, to give you a quick overview of what the display is like, with this phone, we're getting a 6.56-inch 90Hz IPS LCD display with, again, a 720p resolution, a PPI of 269, and a 20:9 aspect ratio. So overall, for the most part, when it comes to stuff like size and dimensions, I do think it is pretty good. At 6.56 inches, it's decently large, so if you're doing stuff like reading, web browsing, social media, things like that, you will at least get an okay experience. And with a 20:9 aspect ratio, we're getting a pretty tall and narrow form factor here. So if you're doing something like watching a video in landscape mode, for example, things will look a bit more immersive. And you're also going to be able to fit more content on the screen without having to scroll as much. And with the 90Hz refresh rate, movement on the screen is going to be a bit faster and smoother. So in general, using the phone is going to feel a bit more premium. But that being said, again, we're only getting a 720p resolution here, and while it doesn't really look that bad, and the colors and everything do look pretty decent, if you're going to be consuming a lot of content where the image quality really matters a lot, like maybe you're watching lots of videos, or looking at photos, or maybe even playing games, in that kind of situation, sure, it's not going to be terrible, and for a phone in this price range, it's again, at least going to be okay. But again, if that's really the main thing you're doing with your phone, then keep in mind, you can spend maybe a little bit more, if even any more, and get something like the Samsung Galaxy A23 5G or the TCL Stylus 5G, for example, that has a 1080p resolution instead. So overall, on one hand, if you're not really going to be doing that many things where the image quality is super important, then sure, the display we're getting with this phone is going to be perfectly fine. But if you really do want the best image quality for the money, then keep in mind you can do better. Now, my second reason why you might not want the OnePlus Nord N300 5G is the storage. Now, this really only goes for power users because honestly, for the average user, with 64GB of internal storage and microSD card expansion, I do think as long as you're mindful of what you're putting on your phone, you should be perfectly fine. But that being said, again, if you're more of a power user, if you're constantly downloading stuff like apps, games, things that tend to take up a bit more storage, then keep in mind 64GB now is definitely not what it was like 10 years ago. And if you do have a bunch of apps and stuff like that, it will fill up pretty quickly. And in this price range, while I feel like 64GB is still quite a bit more common than 128, there are still phones out there that you can get for around the same price that do have 128GB. So again, if you are more of a power user and you really do want that extra storage, then keep in mind, while again, the storage on this phone is going to be at least good enough for the average user, you can still definitely do better if you really want to. My third reason why you might not want the OnePlus Nord N300 5G is because it doesn't really have a whole lot of camera features. Now, with this phone, we're getting a water drop notch for the front-facing camera. Kind of disappointing for OnePlus because usually they have really nice looking hole punches, so I'm not really sure why they brought back this look. But this camera is 16 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a dual camera setup with a 48 megapixel main camera and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. So as you can see, unfortunately, there's no ultra-wide camera and not even a macro camera, which this phone's predecessor, the OnePlus Nord N200 5G, actually did have. Now, I'm not really sure why they took away that feature, but it is pretty disappointing, especially for those of you who are really taking a lot of pictures and you might want a wider variety of features. So if that is you, if you really like to get stuff like close-up detailed images and the wider angle photos you can get with an ultra-wide camera, then I feel like you are going to want to skip this phone because again, this phone really doesn't have a ton of camera features. That being said though, for those of you who are really just taking regular pictures every now and then and using stuff like portrait mode, I do think this phone is actually a pretty good choice because despite not having a ton of features, the 48 megapixel camera can take some really good photos. So if you do want a really affordable phone to take more regular pictures, like maybe you're taking Instagram pictures, for example, where you might be using portrait mode a bit more often, in that kind of situation, I do think the OnePlus Nord N300 5G is actually going to be a pretty good choice. But again, if you are looking for an ultra-wide camera or a macro camera, or maybe even both, in that case, you are going to want to skip this phone because even in this price range, at this point in 2023, those features are honestly so common, you can easily find them in a different phone. My fourth reason why you might not want the OnePlus Nord N300 5G is the software. Now, with this phone, we are getting Android 12, which on one hand isn't really bad. I mean, there are plenty of phones at this point that still have Android 12, but of course we are in Android 13 right now, and at this point we are getting a good amount of phones even in this price range that do have Android 13. So at this point, while having Android 12, especially at this point so early in 2023, really isn't that bad. And if I had to guess, this phone will probably get the update eventually. If you really want the latest version of Android, just keep in mind there are some other options out there. The fifth reason why you might not want the OnePlus Nord N300 5G is the design. Now, on one hand, it doesn't really look terrible. I mean, for being a $200 something phone, it actually does look pretty good. It has decently thin bezels for the most part. I do really like the camera module, and overall the design does look decently high quality. But that being said, keep in mind, this is a OnePlus phone, and I feel like typically OnePlus tends to have much more premium designs than this. I mean, the OnePlus Nord N200 5G looked really nice, but with this phone, we are getting that typical thicker bottom bezel and the water drop notch front-facing camera that you typically find in lower-end phones, and while compared to the average phone in this price range, it's pretty normal. I mean, compared to something like the Samsung Galaxy A14 5G, for example, I do think this phone actually looks quite a bit better. But overall, if you're already used to OnePlus's nicer, more premium kind of designs, then you might be a little disappointed here. My sixth reason why you might not want the OnePlus Nord N300 5G is the video resolution. So for video recording, this phone does have a max recording quality of 1080p in both the rear and front cameras, so unfortunately there's no 4K here. Now on one hand, do I really expect a $200 something phone to be able to record 4K videos? Well, at this point in 2023, maybe. Again, it is pretty early in the year, so I don't really know what's going to be released in the future, but if you're coming from maybe a higher end device that can already record 4K videos, and you're expecting that by 2023 pretty much any phone can, which honestly is a pretty fair assumption, then just keep in mind, phones in this price range typically can't record 4K videos, so if you do want that ability, you are going to have to spend a bit more and get something a bit higher end. And finally, my seventh reason why you might not want the OnePlus Nord N300 5G, and this is honestly more of a straight up limiting factor, as opposed to just being a preference thing, but that is the carrier availability. Now, as of the recording of this video, this phone is actually only being offered through Metro and T-Mobile, and while this may change in the future, I mean, it was kind of like that with the OnePlus Nord N20 5G. At first, it was only available with I think Metro and T-Mobile too, but eventually they did offer a factory unlocked version, so who knows, maybe it's going to change in the future, and by the time you're watching this one could be completely irrelevant. But as of right now, keep in mind, this phone is only available through Metro and T-Mobile, so if you have any other carrier, unfortunately, this phone is not even going to be an option. And honestly, that's really too bad because again, for the most part, I do think this is a really good phone, and it definitely would have been a good option with other carriers too. But again, just keep in mind, if you have any other carrier besides Metro or T-Mobile, you won't be able to use this phone. But those were my reasons why you might not want the OnePlus Nord N300 5G. In general, again, I feel like for what it is, this is actually a really good phone, and despite these drawbacks, if you are looking for a really affordable 5G device that has good performance, takes really nice photos, has a great battery, and a decent amount of features, then I do think this phone is definitely worth considering. Now once again, if you want to learn more about this phone, definitely check out the description, where I will be linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Cleepus Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.